What's up, everybody, and welcome to the Theodor Adorno's introduction to Dialectics. Today we'll be talking about Dialectics, and I'll be pretending to be Theodor Adorno, except I'm not going to shave my head. And these aren't real glasses. These aren't even the glasses that I have that cut out the blue light so that when you're editing all day, you don't get headaches and all that. I have those glasses thanks to my sweetheart buying me some, but these are just fake ones. And I thought I'd pretend to be Theodor Adorno for this lecture because there are authors like Adorno or Butler. In my upcoming book, I actually say this, where it's like, if they're really hard and you don't like how hard their main works are and you want to read them, there are accessible works by them that were really lectures. And it kind of proves that they are able to talk normal, more or less, relatively speaking, though it's not as normal as a politician or a businessman or a pastor who's trying to, get you to be a part of their like consumer demographic, okay, or their membership. This is instead a professor who has academic freedom in the United States because he had fled from totalitarian Germany, and the lectures were done in the 50s, late 50s. 1958, really right before the 60s get going. And if you know much about the Frankfurt School, or if you've ever heard about the Frankfurt School, hold on, I got this one great book. Where is it? Oh no, I knocked my lights down now. This book, The Frankfurt School, Its History, Theories, and Political Significance, is really interesting. And fat, and I'm not done reading it yet, but I'm working on it. And so I can say a couple of things about it. The Frankfurt School was founded by the son of a very, very rich man. The guy who founded the Frankfurt School was himself pretty rich because of his dad. And it was founded as to basically be a Marxist think tank, right? Except that its goal was not just, to lay out whatever the true political program of Marx happens to be, or is thought to be at the time, and then to advance that. It's more complicated than that, because the Frankfurt School for Social Research was basically a think tank outside of the academy in Germany before World War II that was to advance the project Marx had begun, but not in a way that just presumes he had it all figured out and we know what to do now, but instead is very aware of some of the problems that his work had run into. And so it looked to correct for and extend Marx's work, but more than just Marx's work, really, it was to be a sort of social research hub for sociology itself. And critical theory was just a way of doing sociology that specifically looks to change society in fundamental ways. The Frankfurt School thinkers get branded by the right wing in this country as cultural Marxists who gave up on the working class and basically are responsible for the worst of identity politics and relativism, postmodernism, etc. This is a gross simplification. Obviously, any political kind of talking point like that usually is. There's an element of truth in it because a lot of them do give up on class politics. A lot of them do give up on the critique of political economy in a way that I would really care about. I think Grossman is a good example of someone who did not give up on that project. I hope I said his name right. But the reason we're talking about Adorno today, Adorno and Horkheimer, two of the founding members of the Frankfurt School. Horkheimer cared a little bit more about like the working class, in my opinion. But what I like about Adorno, though, is one, I like that he is keen on the fact that dialectics, in the way that is typically thought through traditional Marxism, is a little utopian itself, right? And so Marx was a critic of utopianism. He believed that we need to be based in reality and material reality, and not just say what we want and project what we want and just kind of insist that our feelings can materialize what we want if we just insist on it and collectivize and use force of will. It'll just make it happen. He didn't really think that that was as important as understanding the beast of the system that we were inside of, right? But Adorno sees that the way that dialectics typically gets talked about is where differences and antagonisms between competing factors or opponents are going to be somehow reconcilable, that they're necessarily reconcilable, that there's a necessary trajectory to history where reconciliation and the materialization of the utopian future that we want is not just possible, but is physically, like the physical laws of the universe are determining that outcome. And he writes this book, Negative Dialectics, where it's like a history of philosophy, it's a history of political theory. And, it gets kind of, people say, oh, negative dialectics, not all differences are reconcilable. And sometimes the way that an antithesis and a thesis and an antithesis synthesize is actually not a good thing, right? I don't think that's true. I don't think that that's actually, well, I mean, that's an interesting point, but I don't think that's necessarily the point of his book, Negative Dialectics. That book gets characterized for basically arguing that, and I've seen that multiple times, but I've never seen one of the people who characterized the book that way actually show us, any sort of evidence of having read the text. So I think that's really important. You want to know that they read the book and understood it, which would require reading and rereading and secondary text and then coming back to it and stuff like that. And eventually I'll be there. Eventually, that is one of the texts on my big goals list. But for the time being, this is actually a good introduction to that text, and it's necessary because this Negative Dialectics by Theodor Adorno is renowned for being basically useless. Okay? Basically useless. In the sense of terrible translation and almost unreadable. It's so difficult. I've definitely found sections of it to not be that difficult, but as far as being able to say, oh, the main point of that book is this, I'm not there. And the people who tend to say that, I'm not sure that they're there either. And I'm not saying any of them are charlatans. I'm just saying, look, if that's what your professor said, fair, fine, valid. But I'm a little less sure that I understand what's going on. And the thing is, why care about Theodor Adorno if I like Horkheimer so much more? Well, Adorno was the brains, the fucking nucleus of the Frankfurt School. And all of them looked up to him. They all thought he was just like this powerhouse. And his aesthetic theory is just something that has to be contended with, which is something that I obviously also have not done. But yeah, anyway, so as far as a great place to start, it is, people say you get his introduction to dialectics, and because it's lectures for a public audience, it's going to be a lot more accessible, and it'll lay a good basis for you going forward to, one, know if you actually want to study this, to study his Negative Dialectics, but also two, just to understand dialectics a little bit better, in a less dogmatic way than it's typically taught by the doctrinaires of what gets called traditional Marxism, which is usually something that could more properly be called vulgar Marxism, because Marxism, as it spread through the world, one of the sad things about Marxism was that it supposedly got developed by Lenin, but then he died right after the revolution. I mean, pretty shortly after, when he was already kind of backing off some of the important things that he had said. And then everything got co-opted by Stalinism. That's one way of talking about it. You can also just say that Stalin had to deal with situations that no one could ever really deal with optimally or in a good way. And that there was the best way to read history is as tragedy, where you're not taking the side of people so much as just crying and just saying, I'm so sorry. So sorry you all suffered through this experience. I definitely get why you were trying, but holy shit, y'all. Fuck. But the thing is, I mean, that's, I have, my sympathies go out to people who are, true believers fighting for the good cause. But, one of the things about true believers is they're usually not very philosophical. And, they don't really see it. They only understand philosophy as worldview, or in the German, Weltanschauung.
Weltanschauung. Weltanschauung.
Which, by the way, is not what philosophy is. Now, a person might say, oh, my philosophy is this. I have this philosophy. But that's not... philosophy dismantles, deconstructs, and critically undermines the commonly accepted worldviews, Weltanschauungs, or common philosophies, and or more specifically ideologies. Philosophy is generally opposed to ideology, but the true believers tend to just kind of philosophy, ideology, whatever, and then they will and maybe if they don't like philosophy, or they'll just call it metaphysics. In the case of Stalin or Mao, they'll be like, fucking metaphysics, metaphysicians. Stupid metaphysicians, meaning people who have metaphysical beliefs that they don't. And then they think that they're, historical and dialectical materialism is not metaphysics, it's just reality, when in reality, it is a metaphysics also. Sorry, this is a bit of a side tangent, but what I'm trying to say is that the way that Marxism spread through the world was a vulgarized form of Marxism, because it spread mainly through Joseph Stalin's book called Historical and Dialectical Materialism. Most of the ways that people think about dialectics and dialectical materialism in the world today are because or are heavily influenced by this book that Stalin wrote. And it's also one of the books that a lot of people in the 1960s were reading. Not just Black Panthers, who were definitely reading it, but also just a lot of folks in the New Left read it. And so they either advanced historical and dialectical materialism kind of under a lot of the assumptions and sort of vulgarized presuppositions of the system laid out by Stalin, or else they wrote off the very concept of dialectics as trash because it just looked like the sort of pseudoscientific ideology of relativism that it often appears as. So to reiterate all of that, because I'm fast talking and I'm all over the place, it might seem like to you if you're not keeping up with half the words I'm throwing around. I'll just lay it out like this. Historical and dialectical materialism often gets written off by people who think that all it means is pseudoscientific relativism. So pseudoscience is when you posture as though you're doing science, as though you have claim to objective truth, when you don't, and you're not actually using scientific methods. You're just using the kind of veneer of science, okay? So pseudoscience. And then relativism being like, oh, there's a little bit of truth in everything, and maybe your truth and my truth, everyone can have their own truths, and we can all just kind of synthesize and combine these truths. And then people could say that historical and dialectical materialism is a violent form of that, because ultimately there's, there's the contradictions within the groups, and then there's the contradictions between the revolutionary class and the other classes, and those contradictions can ultimately be worked out within group, and the ones outside of groups, those ones will only come to a conclusion or be overcome through the negation that we call violence, killing, revolutionary struggle. So people could say, well, wow, historical and dialectical materialism are just a form of militant, violent, pseudoscientific relativism that makes people believe that all contradictions can be solved through violent struggle in a revolution. And then this kind of comes along with the idea that if we can just figure out who the right revolutionary subject is, whether it's the working class, whether it's the peasantry, whether it's a combination of the peasantry and first world students, which was what the New Left believed, or whatever. The point is like a lot of people who see dialectics used in this way will write it off as pseudoscientific relativism, and that's fair. Because that is how it gets used by some people. And then there is, on the other hand, the people who buy into it because they were already relativists and they already had a shoddy understanding of science. And then they come across this vulgarized form of Marxism, and then they kind of glom onto it because it kind of just allows them to have their cake and eat it too. Well, that's not what we're doing today, y'all. Today we are turning to the big brain from the Frankfurt School. I'm not saying that he is correct, but I do think that he probably has a better understanding of dialectics than I do. He probably, and I do think that this course will be illuminating for anybody, regardless of whether you have previously in your life written off historical and dialectical materialism or embraced it. It doesn't really matter. I think that you'll get a lot out of this. And it doesn't really matter if you're a doctrinaire or if you're the kind of person who suspends their judgment when dealing with questions of metaphysical or ontological reality. Okay. So, but before we dive into the 18 lectures here, which will all be in a playlist, and you'll be able to click and just play right through, but this will also be available, all of it in one spot, in one episode, as a podcast episode on my podcast, Theory Plebe, which is available on all platforms. But before we do that, I'm going to finish out this section by reading a couple of quotes from a couple of books. And because I am not monetizing this content, and because I am not looking for your money or trying to become famous, I can actually treat this like a professor who has a classroom, or as a, just like your friend. We're doing a book reading group together. Well, we're not trying to make everything short, punchy, to the point, as fast as possible to maximize viewership. Instead, I'm able to read longer quotes and actually break it down in the introduction, mainly because in the rest of the series, I'll be mostly reading, not doing like a commentary, right? But for now, I want to kind of contextualize and situate the entire series that we're about to do with reading a quote from Todd Gitlin's The 60s, where he talks about the ideology of revolution and contradictions, and sort of the way that this vulgarized form of dialectics was being embraced and used in the late 1960s, during the time that things were getting pretty extreme and people were burning out. And when people are burning out and dropping out of politics, the people who remain think that it confirms all of their opinions that they've been advocating for, and so they get louder and at the same time more moralistic and antagonistic, because they actually believe that they're on the right side of history and that they can galvanize action by getting louder. When if you're the only person who's being loud and everybody else is like, no, you don't get it anymore, then it actually can backfire. And for instance, if you don't believe me, then just think of a person who's in a room, everybody else is like tired, and you have one person who's like, let's go bowling. or whatever, just some physical activity that requires going to a place for a few hours, and everyone else is just like, oh my God, no. It's like revolution can be similar when you have a person who's like, revolution, it's time for revolution, and everybody else is like, so I've got bread in the cabinet, I've got work tomorrow, I've got rent due next week. Your revolution has no plan to cover those things. I think not. And so, yeah, it's like we're not on the same wavelength. We're not on the same, we're reading from different pages, apparently. It's like, yeah, feel the room. Sometimes people think they can galvanize action from other people by just using fear tactics and getting really excited and saying that the time is now. But they're not really feeling the spirit of the times. They're trying to channel the spirit of the times from some previous time. They're probably reading books from some previous time. But in reality, we're here now, and the opportunity has already passed us by, and we're going to have to do a lot more longer term planning and base building so that we are actually prepared for the next time that the movement energies arise. Well, right now ain't it. And so the time for reading and reflecting and learning from the mistakes of the past is now. And so anyway, towards that end, I wanted to read this section from Gitlin's book. And like I was saying, I'm not going to rush it. I'm going to read like a full 2 pages. And if that makes you go, oh my God, I can't wait, go, and you go away, you click off, come back when you're ready for it. Okay. Come back when you're ready. This is the big kids club now. Okay. So here we go. I'm going to read. So Gitlin, as you can see, I actually have the book right here, the 60s, the front cover fell off, but I'll just be sharing it like this so you can see it here on the screen. See if I can make it bigger. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so you can read along if you want to, if that helps you. If this is the podcast version, though, you won't be able to read along. No worries. It's hard to listen along to several pages at a time for some folks, but listening comprehension and focus, attention, that stuff is a muscle that has to be exercised. And so there is a sort of virtue in always trying to exercise it because it will always make you better. So, and then the best part about listening to a recording is that you can always come back to it later, especially if you're a truck driver or a shelf stalker or a pizza delivery driver or any kind of work that allows you to listen while on the job. Hell yeah. Welcome to this series. I'm going to read. So he's talking about the late 1960s. So he spent like the first, 2/3 of this book talking about how Students for a Democratic Society had formed, talking about the various phases that it went through. He was one of the leading founding members of Students for a Democratic Society, and that was the biggest student-run activist organization in the United States at the time. And so he had an insider view of everything. And so, but now we're getting to the late 60s, and well, it's getting dark. And this is from the chapter. What chapter is this? Okay, so yeah, this is from chapter 15, which is called The Spring of Hope, the Winter of Despair, where he says at the beginning of it, everything was at stake. Anything seemed possible. There was the promise of universal liberation. There was the profaning of everything holy. The end of time was approaching. Nothing was changing. There was a leap toward equality. There was a degradation of standards. There was disgust with the Pentagon's perversion of reason. There was a flight from the rigors of intellect. There was the revelation that America benefited from the misery of the poor countries. There was the glorification of third world tyrannies. There was the unmasking of capitalism. There was the reflex that capitalism was the root of all evil. There was a revulsion against vast and impersonal violence. There was violence that was going to end all violence. There was an opening of doors. There was a closing of minds. There was a psychedelic rapture. There was the scrambling of brains by bad drugs and too many drugs and the siren song of madness. There was a search for fresh language. There was an epidemic of cant. There was universal love. There was the right to say fuck on the movie screen. For every face of authority, there was someone to slap it. Dickens is irresistible. For in 1968, 1969, 1970, polarizations were the common syntax. Extremities were ordinary. Reality was a blur. Contradiction was commonplace. More than one war, indeed, came home. Okay, so you get the sense for it, right? For kind of, first of all, that Gitlin he's a good author. I mean, he's a good writer, at least. It's a great opening to this chapter. He says, I was hardly alone in taking Chicago as a revelation that there was no turning back. Much of the movement felt that way. So did local and federal authorities. All the more so once Richard Nixon took over the White House. So Chicago, there had been the Chicago riots, and a lot fewer people showed up for those riots than had been hoped, and a lot more people who got involved with those riots were like these greasers or other gangs who were not political in any way, and who were kind of just taking advantage of an opportunity to be violent. Then you also had like violent factions of militant activist groups that were there, but the main thing was seeing the numbers dwindling so much. You gave this sort of self-righteous sense to those who actually were there, that everything's on the table, that they really need to galvanize people to action. The only way that they can actually get other people to get into action is to actually smash everything, and they thought that would just ripple out, but it was actually having a sort of counter effect. It was not actually doing what they hoped. It was actually making people kind of recoil from the movement even faster. So at least that's what Gitlin thought. So he says in the year after, so he's saying that after Chicago, there's no turning back. Like basically the people who are still in the movement think like we either make it happen or the decade's been wasted, right? In the year after August 1968, it was as if both official power and movement counterpower equally and passionately were committed to stoking up 2, 3, many Chicagos, each believing that the final showdown of good and evil, order and chaos was looming. During that year and the next, the political edge of the opposition proceeded in 2 keys at once. There were confrontations with power, aiming to unmask illegitimate authority, to give aid and comfort to its victims, and to build the movement. Alongside, in communes and collectives, there were the exuberant, fitful, and flawed attempts to live a new way of life. The battles raged, known by their sites like scenes from a war or Stations of the Cross. Campus confrontations. I'm going to skip ahead here. He's just giving a summary for the moment. And hit to the next paragraph. He says, in the course of 1968 through 69, there were well over 100 politically inspired campus bombings, attempted bombings, and incidents of arson nationwide, aimed at ROTC buildings, other campus and government buildings, high schools, even electrical towers. In the spring of 1969 alone, 300 colleges and universities holding a third of American students saw sizable demonstrations, a quarter of them marked by strikes or building takeovers, a quarter more by disruption of classes and administration, a fifth accompanied by bombs, arson, or the trashing of property. Journalists recognized the movement as a running story, like Vietnam. Rare was the day when the major newspapers failed to devote at least an entire page to tracking its fever chart. Every week, the underground press recorded arrests, trials, police hassles, and brutalities, demonstrations against the war, demonstrations of blacks and then Hispanics and then other people of color and their white allies, demonstrations by GIs against the war, crackdowns by the military, and there were more of these underground papers and their radio equivalents all the time. By July 1969, the Los Angeles Free Press sold 95,000 copies a week, and Berkeley Barb 85,000. The East Village Other 65,000, all up from 5,000 or fewer in 1965. So basically, the media found that sensationalizing the hype around these student antics was good business, and there was a little while in the 60s where that kind of continued. Later on, the media gets a better grasp of how to handle and work with the repressive apparatuses of the state to make sure that that would not happen the same way anymore. So basically, he'll get into that later in the book. I'm not going to go read that part right now, but the point is that they start doing a little less coverage, and eventually they start just not showing that stuff. And as a result, the movement, first, everyone gets the sense that the movement is like being led by people who think that it's the end of the world, and are willing to blow things up, which makes fewer people want to get involved with what had formerly been a mass movement. And then the media kind of just pulls away, and the whole thing is like shut off. And, the people who are still fighting the good fight in the 70s get some news coverage, but for the most part are on their own in the dark. And eventually the burnout ensues and neoliberalism takes over and everybody goes into a consumerist life. Okay, but the part I want to skip to here is the next section of this chapter called The Language of the Millennium. And this is where it's going to be relevant to dialectics and what I was calling vulgar dialectics, because we're going to be talking about contradictions and how the ideology of revolution for certain kinds of self-proclaimed revolutionaries will function to act as though we don't have to understand and work through our contradictions, that those will all be basically overcome in bloodshed when it comes to the actual revolutionary moment, which is kind of looked to like the return of Jesus by some people. We're just waiting for that perfect moment, and then it'll take care of the contradictions. Okay, so here we go. The language of the millennium. Accordingly, the movement's language hardened into blunt instruments. From the Black Panthers, white leftists borrowed the slogan, "Power to the people," generously stretched by the Panthers to "Power to the people, black power to black people." This was reassuring to whites, although it did leave open the question of what happens when racist whites fight for the power to keep blacks out, an issue that later became a live one in school busing fights. Then came People's War, borrowed from Vietnam, although even revolutionists found it hard to fit to the United States with a straight face. In parentheses, he says, when a 1969 Progressive Labor headline said People's War is invincible, for example, the joke went around Harvard SDS that PL had misspelled invisible. But above the figures of speech loomed one supreme talisman, the revolution. In the summer of 1969, for example, the embattled Black Panthers urgently called for a united front against fascism, but kept up their faith with the notion that 1970 would be the year of the revolution. Okay, here we go. To invoke the revolution, which is in all caps, is capitalized, was to claim title to the future, to see beyond raids and trials and wiretaps and empire and war and guilt, to justify the tedium of mimeographing one more leaflet, working out one more position, suffering through one more insufferable meeting. The revolution. The name of our desire became firm and precise. Never mind the absence of a vision of reconstruction by dint of the definite article. Through the magic of a phrase, the students and Lupin proletarians of this unprecedented post-scarcity society were joined to Parisian communards of 1871 and Muscovite workers of 1917 and Vietnamese peasants and Parisian students of 1968. To speak of the revolution was automatically to acquire a pedigree, heroes, martyrs, allies, texts, and therefore anchorage. No mean achievement for this unmoored movement floundering around in an unfathomably rich and violent America. It was to take heart and mind from Marx, Bakunin, Lenin, Sacco, and Vanzetti, Wilhelm Reich, Che, Mao, Fidel, Ho, from Brazil's urban underground or Guatemala's guerrillas slipping into villages to show the Indians that the military regime was not omnipotent. Take your pick. They were all professionals who had fought against the odds and hadn't quit. If you hated Stalinism, you could work up your own genealogy. Rosa Luxemburg, Emma Goldman, Trotsky, assorted other combinations, and they could qualify, arguably, as the revolution's authentic lineage. It was to overlook distinctions between Vietnam, where Ho had led a nationalist movement against no fewer than 3 invading armies since 1930, and Bolivia, say, where Che was not able even to speak the language of the impoverished Indians, let alone distinctions between the Third World and the First. So revolution, he's saying, was to overlook these distinctions and these differences, and these differences in distinction. To speak of the revolution as to postpone vexing questions about socialism, anarchism, democracy. The revolution was a solvent for strategic doubts, moral qualms, and interscene skirmishes. When disputes erupted, "Come the revolution" could mean later for that, much later. What made the revolutionary mood possible was more than apocalyptic events. It was the collective willingness to suspend one's better judgment. We had been to college, after all, had studied sociology and read history, knew that in the classical revolutions, three things happened. There was a revolutionary class or coalition. The establishment was not only deeply divided, but incapable of keeping order and delivering the goods, and the police and army crumbled. No less an authority than Barrington Moore Jr. took to the pages of the New York Review of Books to remind us of these home truths. But if you were suitably inflamed to begin with, Moore's very title, Revolution in America, confirmed that the feasibility of revolution was the right question. Anyway, hadn't every revolution, every successive phase in the revolution, been unprecedented in its time and in its own way? Hadn't the odds always been long? All that remained was to identify the protagonists. The third world? Blacks? Industrial workers? Working class toughs? Salaried professionals? The young as a whole? In any event, wasn't it clear by now that revolution, even if not imminent, was indispensable? Even the reformist goal of ending the war seemed impervious to reformist tactics. He puts reformist in scare quotes, so I'll say that again. Even the reformist goal of ending the war seemed impervious to reformist tactics, meaning like, doesn't that prove the necessity of the revolution, right? Then he says, a revolution is, in quotes, he says, a revolution is probably necessary if rationality is to be restored to a society that thinks it has been operating rationally, wrote Richard Poirier in The Atlantic. Speaking of youth as a cultural force that signals the probable beginnings of a new millennium. He was speaking of youth as a cultural force that signals the probable beginnings of a new millennium. Okay, we're almost done, but we're getting there. This is most of it, but he kind of brings it together here. So to invoke the revolution was, in short, to acquire prepackaged identity, international sweep, and historical precedent for a breathtaking exercise of will. Black, white, male, female, Democrats, anti-Democrats, children of suburbs and ghettos, if in all our diversity, all our conflicts of style and objective, we were destined in world historical Hegelian fashion to live out fragments of the true and single revolution, then obstacles and even disasters could be seen as transitional, the errors and sins just friction in the machinery. The revolution was an eschatological certainty. Revolution was an eschatological certainty. Eschatology is like, in theology, it means like end times or what comes at the end, right? So, like eschatology could mean like after death, like you all go to heaven or hell. Eschatology could also mean like the coming of Jesus, like at the end times. It can mean a bunch of shit. Like it means different things in different religions. But what we're saying right here, revolution was an eschatological certainty, is meaning that it was basically a theological supposition at this point. It was taken as a given, a future already unfolding, history cresting the flotsam and jetsam of mere history. If we failed to see it, it was only because our experience and interests and therefore our visions were partial. Thus, the importance of ceremonial moments when the benign, if at times brutal, necessity of history made itself manifest. The epiphany of the Battle of Algiers, for example, when the left, black and white unusually together, would crowd into art film houses to behold the counterinsurgent French sounding like Americans with their rhetoric of pacification and the damned of the earth overcoming scruples and setting off bombs in the cafes. It was a time suited to the poem found over many a movement desk in which Bertolt Brecht told posterity, or the future generations, alas, we who wish to lay the foundations of kindness could not ourselves be kind, but you, when at last it comes to pass that man can help his fellow man, do not judge us too harshly. The present was a transitional period on the midnight special to a better place. Later, as sectarian wars boiled up from the collective unconscious of the revolution, revolutionaries could flatter themselves that if they themselves failed to be kind, it was a great pity, but not a disqualification from the throne of history. The revolution was the ultimate alibi. What followed from the revolutionary metaphor and the utopianism flaming within it was a corollary usage, the Marxist-Maoist language of contradiction. Here we go. Built into the term was the premise that the world is, at least potentially, a coherent logical system in which conflicts are kinks destined to be straightened out. Contradictions existed between forces, between gigantic abstractions like classes, and there was something reassuring about that too, for it meant that individuals who took the incorrect position now and then were simply miseducated and could be brought around. The flood tide of reason was ultimately, one of Marx's and Engels' favorite weasel words when they wrote in their prophetic mode, not to be denied. So he's saying the flood tide of reason was ultimately not to be denied. And he's saying that this word ultimately is a weasel word when Marx and Engels fall into their prophetic mode, which, to be fair, they do fall into their prophetic mode from time to time, which is why some people think that Marx was basically on board with the vulgar Marxist kind of Stalinist, dialectical materialist teleological certainty, the whole idea that the whole universe is Newtonian physically determined to produce the result of a communist future, this is just like a physical, the physical forces playing themselves out in evolution. It's going to take us there. So at times, Marx and Engels would get into that sort of prophetic mode. So he's not wrong. You can tell Gitlin's probably less sympathetic to Marx than I am, because I think he only really saw Marxists talking their vulgarized Marxism, and he himself was less educated in the critique of political economy, which is the aspect of Marx that I like, which is not the aspect that usually gets really worked through or extended or understood by traditional Marxists, but there you have it. All right, so the word contradiction confirmed one's knowingness. Once it's spread even among novices who wondered in private what they were really talking about. The word contradiction confirmed one's knowingness. Whence it's spread even among novices who wondered in private what they were really talking about. So people talking in private, they would use this word contradiction to confirm that they're in the know, when, it's just a way of ultimately letting yourself off the hook of really having to explain how you understand, because if you just perceive contradictions, you don't really have to work through and understand or qualify them. You can just contradictions, they'll be resolved. Don't worry about it. That's dialectics. In public, late SDS, Student for a Democratic Society, and Black Panther leaders brandished the word with a smile and an air of condescension, hinting that they were in possession of the philosopher's stone. The left was crisscrossed, however, by chasms of experience and ideology not so easily wished away. That's the end of that section. The revolution was the ultimate alibi. It would eventually absolve every contradiction and everything would be worked out fine. Well, that is not what Adorno thinks dialectics is, and it's a reason to, read Adorno. But before we get into the 18 sections that we're about to dive into of this lecture series, I first I'm going to read this beautiful metaphor where Hegel is, in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, his most well-known work, using this metaphor. It's a beautiful metaphor to kind of say what he thinks dialectics is. This is a notoriously difficult book, much like Negative Dialectics by Theodor Adorno. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit is known to be one of the hardest works out there. It's actually not half as hard as his Science of Logic, which is much harder. But, because at least he gives examples in this book. But in the Science of Logic, he's a lot more abstract, if you can believe that. Though, at the same time, that is his more mature work. And so, as far as like goals go, someday I hope to actually be able to talk about the Science of Logic in a way that shows I, know what I'm talking about. Like, I want to be able to, more importantly, teach whatever's useful in there. If there's anything useful in there, who knows? My Hegelian friends think there definitely is. I don't doubt them. All right, so the first 2 pages of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, absolutely beautiful. I'm just going to read it. Like I said, we have the time in this episode. I really just hate that the algorithms have made people want to say, got to keep it short, got to keep it simple, got to keep it to the point. We got to, and then we pander to people with the shortest attention, and then we wonder why everyone's so distracted and unable to focus nowadays. Yeah? So we're doing the opposite. Try harder. Listen, repeat, come back to it. You'll get it over time. Don't worry. We're all distracted. We're all getting better. Or at least the ones who are staying, we're getting better. So here it goes. It is customary to preface a work with an explanation of the author's aim, why he wrote the book, and the relationship in which he believes it to stand to other earlier or contemporary treatises on the same subject. In the case of a philosophical work, however, such an explanation seems not only superfluous, but in view of the nature of the subject matter, even inappropriate and misleading. For whatever might appropriately be said about philosophy in a preface, say a historical statement of the main drift in the point of view, the general content and results, a string of random assertions and assurances about truth, none of this can be accepted as the way in which to expound philosophical truth. Also, since philosophy moves essentially in the element of universality, which includes within itself the particular, it might seem that here more than in any other of the sciences, the subject matter itself, and even in its complete nature, were expressed in the aim of the final results, the execution being by contrast really the unessential factor. On the other, don't worry, I'll kind of explain what I think he's trying to say here in a second. I'm just going to read a little bit more. On the other hand, in the ordinary view of anatomy, for instance, say the knowledge of the parts of the body regarded as inanimate, we are quite sure that we do not as yet possess the subject matter itself, the content of the science, but must in addition exert ourselves to know the particulars. Further, in the case of such an aggregate of information, which has no right to bear the name of science, an opening talk about aim and other such generalities is usually conducted in the same historical and uncomprehending way in which the content itself, these nerves, muscles, etc., is spoken of. In the case of philosophy, on the other hand, this would give rise to the incongruity that, along with the employment of such a method, its ability to grasp the truth would also be demonstrated. Okay, what is he saying? He's saying, like, we cannot get to the heart of what philosophy is doing by saying, oh, so this philosopher is basically believes this, and the implications of that are this, and the basic way that the philosopher got to that conclusion was this, and there you have it. Now you understand that philosopher. No, you actually have to read the working through the thought to be able to actually understand it. So he's saying that a preface is almost pointless. Why would you do a preface to a book that is supposed to show the movements of thought? You can't just describe the movements of thought. You actually have to move with the movements of thought to be able to follow along those steps to be able to get to that perspective. That's what he's saying in his own complicated, seemingly perhaps convoluted way. Though now that my comprehension is higher than the first time I read this, I can say it makes a lot more sense now, and that's very nice. But the next section, the next page, So this is actually like these paragraphs are all numbered in this translation. So that was that was paragraph 1. Paragraph 2, though, is where he's going to use this beautiful metaphor for how he thinks that understanding and truth through dialectical evolution sort of functions, okay? And this is just, before we get into Adorno's introduction to dialectics, I feel like it's really important, for me at least, just as an educator, to just let you all know what my favorite kind of understanding of dialectics actually is, using Hegel, the guy who coins the term really, or at least brands it, I guess, showing you like the metaphor that he uses to describe it in the preface to his own book on the topic. So he says, here we go, paragraph 2, he says, furthermore, the very attempt to define how a philosophical work is supposed to be connected with other efforts to deal with the same subject matter drags in an extraneous concern, and what is really important for the cognition of the truth is obscured. So the understanding gets obscured because this other thing gets dragged into it. The more conventional opinion gets fixated on the antithesis of truth and falsity. The more it tends to expect a given philosophical system to be either accepted or contradicted, and hence it finds only acceptance or rejection. This is very true, especially for, at the time, Hegel had spent a lot of time reading the, not just German idealists to come before him, but also the British empiricists, who tend to see things in terms of, well, it's either true or it's not. It's either or, yes or no. That's kind of something is true or it's not. A is A or it's not. That is one of the fundamental axioms. It's called like the principle of non-contradiction. It's a fundamental building block of logic itself. And he's saying that's not always useful. That's not always going to help us understand the truth by just seeing things through that. It's either true or it's not. It's either real or it's not. Like, he's saying that there's a more important way to understand here. And so he says, it does not comprehend the diversity. So this approach that sees things in black and white, yes or no, true or false. He says, it does not comprehend the diversity of philosophical systems as the progressive unfolding of truth, but rather sees in it simple disagreements. And now here's the beautiful metaphor. He says, the bud disappears in the bursting forth of the blossom, and one might say that the former is refuted by the latter. Similarly, when the fruit appears, the blossom is shown up in its turn as a false manifestation of the plant, and the fruit now emerges as the truth of it instead. So just think about the life cycle of a plant. Go from bud to sprout to then you got the plant, and then you got the fruit. The blossom is shown up in its turn as a false manifestation of the plant, and the fruit now emerges as the truth of it instead. He's basically saying, like, if you're like one of these empiricists who just sees everything through true or false, then you'd be like, you're looking at the plant and you're like, the blossom is the truth of this plant. That's what it was, all growing just to be, this blossom. And then all of a sudden that blossom turns into fruit, and then you're like, it was actually the fruit all along. Okay. He says these forms are not just distinguished from one another, they also supplant one another as mutually incompatible. So through this view, each one of these is an incompatible relation. He says, yet at the same time, their fluid nature makes them moments of an organic unity in which they not only do not conflict, but in which each is as necessary as the other. And this mutual necessity alone constitutes the life of the whole. But he who rejects a philosophical system, for instance, the new philosopher, does not usually comprehend what he is doing in this way. And he who grasps the contradiction between them, the historian of philosophy, does not, as a general rule, know how to free it from its one-sidedness, or maintain in it its freedom by recognizing the reciprocally necessary moments that take shape as a conflict and seeming incompatibility. So he's saying that a lot of things in life, whether it's a plant, a dog, or a person, will appear one way and we take that to be its truth, and then it appears in another way and then we take that to be its truth, and then because we think that something's either true or false, we go, well, then this truth is to the exclusion of what I thought before, so then that one must be wrong. So, and he's saying this is not always a useful way of understanding an organic unity. Really, the stem of that flower is as much a part of that flower that later becomes, the fruit. That it's through time, it evolves. But it's not just, it's not in its essential nature more true in one moment than another, right? It's an unfolding of truth. So yeah, that was read from the translation, the A.V. Miller translation of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. That was paragraphs 1 and 2. Paragraph 2 is the one that gets into the metaphor of the plant. I just think that it's a beautiful way of talking about an organic unity and kind of showing how this limiting way of looking at things as black and white, true or false, this sort of sometimes useful logical distinction can be, if made unilateral and fundamental to every philosophical way of thinking, it can become counterproductive because it can make us think that there's falsity where there's not. It can make us think that there's truth where there's not. And the most important part is we miss the forest for the tree. We miss the tree. Is that how you say it? We miss the forest. Yeah, we miss the forest for the tree because we are looking at, this is this proposition true or false, instead of trying to understand the bigger picture that these parts play within. So going back over everything we've done so far, the 60s Years of Hope, Days of Rage by Todd Gitlin. He's basically talking about how the ideology of revolution utilizes a sort of vulgarized, I'm saying vulgarized. He just says this is, it kind of utilizes this sort of idea that contradictions will just be resolved in the revolution. Everybody postpones disagreements, says, hey, we can work together. So the anarchists and the Marxists, even though they are fundamentally enemies and always going to have to be against each other when it actually comes down to it, they all just say, postpone that. We're all comrades here and we can just push towards the revolution. And I'm not saying that there aren't anarcho-Marxists or Marxist anarchists who haven't found a way to make it work, but I am saying that most anarchists and most Marxists are fundamentally irreconcilable, but there is this sort of dialectical notion in revolutionary ideology that's very popular that, once we get to the revolution, like the definitive, real, eschatological revolution, the one that all of history has nearly been a teleology towards, once we get there, the panacea of all contradictions being resolved will have arrived. And so we can just postpone these difficult questions and what we're calling contradictions. We can postpone all of that because really that's just the friction of the gears of the clockwork of history moving us towards the destination, which is our destiny. Okay. So I don't like that. I think that is a way that we've been stuck in a rut and that we need to break out of it. And so will we find something useful towards the end of breaking out of such ruts in Adorno's lectures that go into dialectics? I hope so. They're relatively short. They're pretty clear, and they get into the history of philosophy in a pretty cool way. But here we go. Now I'm going to finish out this introductory video, which is pretty long, with like a 3 or 4 page piece. It's the editor's foreword from Adorno's Introduction to Dialectics, so that you can just hear what the editor had to say about this collection in the editor's own words. Here we go. The series of lectures which Adorno delivered at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt in the summer semester of 1958 can still be said to provide what the original announcement in the official lecture lists promised. It offers an introduction to dialectics, presented in a free and improvised style. Adorno's theoretical reflections here are generally more accessible than comparable discussions in his writings on Hegel or in negative dialectics. The lecture course can thus certainly be regarded as a kind of propedeutic, a word which means of an area of study serving as a preliminary instruction or as an introduction to further study. An introduction to a subject of area of study. Okay, sure. Okay, so he's saying that this sort of free and improvised style of Adorno's theoretical reflections presented to a general audience here will serve as a sort of propedeutic to Hegel's work as well as to negative dialectics itself, which is Adorno's big book. In reading out specific passages from Hegel and interpreting them in some detail, Adorno clarifies central motifs of dialectical thought such as the movement of the concept, or the meaning of determinate negation and dialectical contradiction. But he also makes it easier to approach this tradition of thought for those who already entertain skeptical or downright hostile attitudes towards it, insofar as he systemically explores the difficulties that it involves, addresses the resistance and the prejudices which it typically encounters, and discusses the specific challenges which dialectical thought presents. The only readers likely to be disappointed by Adorno's treatment of these questions are those who expect to be offered an instant recipe for such thinking. If you're looking for that, there are other YouTube videos for you, I guarantee you. There are a lot of YouTube videos that say you don't have to put in the work. They did it for you. As Hegel was making the point of here in the Phenomenology of Spirit preface, that's not going to happen. You can't have other people do the struggle for you and then just tell you the story and now you've been on that journey too. It doesn't work that way when it comes to mind and development of thought. So he says that Adorno so on that note though, he says that Adorno insists it belongs to the essence of dialectic that it is no recipe but an attempt to let truth reveal itself. In terms of Adorno's own development, these lectures document a moment of some significance, since this is the first time that the issue of dialectics is expressly addressed. A couple of years before the plan for a work on dialectics as such assumed definite shape in Adorno's mind, what we have here is a kind of methodological self-reflection on his previous substantive contributions, one where he explores for the first time that idea of an open or fractured dialectic, which he will finally go on to develop at length in negative dialectics. This is evident above all from Adorno's original general plan for the lectures, which in its almost symphonic layout affords some insight into how his philosophy, in express relation to and with a constant eye upon the work of Hegel and Marx, attempts to situate and articulate itself. But the actual execution of the lectures, which differs significantly from the original plan in several respects, also explicates the central motifs of Adorno's own conception of dialectic, its definition as an attempt to do justice in thought itself to the non-identical, that is, precisely to those moments which are not exhausted in our thought. The emphasis upon its originally critical function, its specific opposition to ontology and positivism alike, its complementary relationship to the idea of negative metaphysics, and finally the question so important to Adorno of that individual motivation for engaging with dialectics which today, when the inner, namely dialectical contradictions of capitalism are rousing us from a sort of postmodern somnolence, actually seems to have lost none of its relevance, namely the experience of diremption or alienation, which makes us realize how dialectical thought itself responds to a negative condition of the world and, indeed, calls this negative condition by its proper name, but without thereby relinquishing the hope that what strives for reconciliation is something itself harbored within the diremption, the negative, the suffering of the world. Adorno delivered these 1-hour lectures twice a week and presented them, as was usual with him, in a fairly free form that was based loosely on the notes and jottings he had set down beforehand. The lectures were recorded on tape as they were delivered, not specifically for subsequent publication, but primarily for Adorno's own use, and were then transcribed. This transcription of the tape recordings forms the basis of the present edition and is preserved in the Theodor W. Adorno archive under blah, 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 blah. On account of a 1-week break after Easter, Adorno actually delivered 20 lectures rather than the 22 that were originally planned. No transcription has survived of the opening lecture, so that in this case, the text is based on a stenograph by someone who can no longer be identified. The presentation of the text follows the general editorial principles established for the posthumously published lectures of Adorno. This means that the primary intention here was not to produce a critical edition of the text, but one that would be as immediately accessible as possible, especially since with all the lectures, we are not dealing with texts which Adorno composed in written form or even authorized as such. In order to preserve the immediate oral character of the lectures, the syntax of the original, as recorded in the transcription, was left unaltered as far as this was possible, which is just awesome because I'm reading it to you. So these were meant to be oral in the first place. They've tried to maintain the integrity of these as oral as they can. And, you know, I'll try to make it more interesting than Adorno would have. I promise. I promise. I use intonation. I don't know how much he used. He looks like the kind of guy who is talking like this all the time, but I don't know. This rule has not been observed in a small number of cases where intelligibility would otherwise be severely compromised. And, you know, so it's just going to go on and on into the sort of like, as an editor, you know, the person writing this is responsible for making sure that you know that they've done their best job possible to preserve the integrity of what was said, even if the letter sometimes gets in the way of what they were saying. And so we're going to have to, for the time being, trust that editor until people in the comment sections below, maybe over time in the future, will be like, hey, we're the editor of those lectures had actually substituted this word for that. Maybe actually it makes more sense if it was this. You know, yeah, I look forward to that happening, possibly. Really look forward to doing this. And I'm going to try to post these 18 lectures twice per week until they're all up. Is it really 18? I thought he said that it's 20. See, this whole time I keep saying it's 18. It's actually 20, y'all. Okay, so I'll be publishing these 20 lectures read by yours truly over the course of the next 10 weeks. Hopefully 2 will be published per week, and I hope that you'll be able to keep up with these, but if not, just know that they're here and that they will hopefully be here in the future, and that they're a resource to you and others so that we can all hopefully grow and learn and better ourselves, and that this will, on the one hand, lay a good basis for us in approaching Hegel and Marx and Adorno, but on the other hand, that it will just make us better philosophers in general, to think through the history of philosophy and the concept of dialectics from Plato through Marx. So I really look forward to it, and thank you so much for joining. I'm going to cut this off now. Much love.